Heritage. The protection of buildings to preserve them for future generations. I don't think anyone will necessarily disagree with me when I say that's a good thing. So why am I making a video critiquing it? Well, heritage, as I see today, has some issues. Namely that it's very susceptible to be weaponised due to the view it takes on the role heritage should play in urban planning. So to understand my point, we need to talk about how heritage works in Australia. So in Australia, we have 5 levels of heritage protection: world, national, Commonwealth, state, and local. All of which have vaguely similar rules as to what you can or cannot do with a property on that list. Although I'm grossly oversimplifying there because this video is going to mostly focus on local, as that's where I view most of the issues are. Anyway, local heritage is controlled at the council level, and as you can probably guess, is for items of local importance, for example a historical pub or a house. Each council is required to put out what's called a local environmental plan every few years. And amongst other things, it lists all the buildings that are heritage listed, as well as all the heritage conservation areas within a local government area, as well as what can or cannot be done with those properties. The rules do change from council to council, but in general, you cannot change or demolish a heritage listed property without a heritage assessment or consent from the council. Obviously, some work can be done without going through this process. For example, maintaining the property, you don't need consent, but even this can change from council to council. So this sounds pretty good. We should preserve historically or culturally significant buildings. But there's a problem. A building can be individually heritage listed, which most people are probably familiar with, but it can also be part of a heritage conservation area. These work similarly to an individual heritage listing. These work similarly, and their function is to preserve buildings within their context, which is why they can apply from everything from a small cul-de-sac to an entire suburb. And here's where we get onto the issue. That being, there's lots of them. Here is a map of Sydney with heritage conservation areas overlaid on top. The red striped areas are heritage conservation areas, and as you can see, almost the entire inner west and eastern suburbs are all heritage conservation areas. Okay, so what's the problem here? Well, it has restrictions on what can or cannot be built. So if we take the inner west C1 heritage conservation area, which covers most of the suburb of Annandale, you can't demolish any buildings built pre-1939, nor can you amalgamate blocks, and the purpose of this is done to preserve the character of the area. As a result, the suburb of Annandale, which is right next to CBD, and the University of Sydney, looks like this. Actually, I lied. That was Liverpool, an hour from the CBD. This is what Annandale looks like. It is very low density, and really hasn't changed much since the 1930s. And it would be fine if we weren't in a housing crisis, which is caused in part by the fact that you cannot demolish or build anything new in most inner city suburbs, which you know are the areas that are close to job centres, schools, public transport, things that we should be encouraging people to live near. So when you know that there is this level of red tape that stops you building anything new in inner city suburbs, it's not surprising that the majority of the growth is expected to occur out west on the urban fringe. Just look at this map for projected population growth between 2021 and 2041. It's no shock that the inner west isn't growing. You can't build anything. The net result of these policies is that the brunt of the population growth is being put on suburbs far from job centres and lacking in utilities. The result is longer commutes, worse environmental outcomes, and worse personal outcomes for people. Is this a result of heritage legislation? Obviously not. Nothing is that simple. But it's hard to argue it's not a contributing factor. So what solution do I propose? Should we abolish heritage conservation areas or the heritage list? No, of course not. That's a bad idea. At least in my opinion, our common heritage should be preserved. But I think we need to remember that it's our common heritage. It belongs to me as much as it belongs to you. So first off, we need to recognise that heritage conservation areas should be affordable to the average person. If we take my previous example of the suburb of Annandale, compared to Greater Sydney, its median monthly mortgage repayments are nearly $1,000 higher, as well as the median weekly rent being also $100 higher. When compared to other areas of Sydney, suburbs like Annandale are significantly more expensive. And it's not surprising to find out when you look at the median weekly household income of people in Annandale, it's nearly $600 higher than it is in the rest of Greater Sydney. It's not like it was always this way. Annandale started as a master planned suburb for the middle class in the 1870s, before a bubonic plague outbreak in 1910. Sent a lot of those people out west to the new railway suburbs. And the result of which was it became a slum, and only really picked up again once industry moved in after the end of the First World War. At which point, it became a working class suburb, and it remained that way until it was gentrified. There's actually a decent argument that by increasing the affordability of these areas, and allowing working class and middle class people to live in these areas, we're actually preserving the character better than if we just preserve the buildings on their own. So how do we actually do that to make it more affordable? Simple. Build more housing, which a lot of these areas are just not doing. For instance, between 2006 and 2021, Annandale built a whopping total of 483 new homes. Compare this to Liverpool, which built 5,266. Okay, so build more homes. But how do we do that while still preserving the heritage of the area? Well, I think a good example to look at would be Central Station. It's also heritage listed, albeit individually, and on the state register. And I'm sure a lot of people following this channel would agree, it's a very significant building, arguably more so than an entire suburb like Annandale. Since it opened in 1906, Central has been the gateway into Sydney for generations of Australians. But it's not the same as it was in 1906. Imagine if we turned around and said, it has to be kept in its 1906 condition. That means no city circle, as suburban platforms we know today were originally terminating platforms. That also means no Eastern Suburbs Railway, no electrification whatsoever, since that required modifying the platforms, as well as no fancy concourse, like the one that recently opened. In this rather dumb scenario, Central wasn't able to evolve. It was stuck in 1906, which would be fine if it were in a museum. But it's not. It's the heart of the rail network. Railway stations and railways themselves need to evolve. The Sydney of 1906 is very different to the Sydney of 2023. As a result, Central, and Sydney Trains as a whole, has evolved greatly in that time. But for some reason we then turn around to our suburbs and say, no, they cannot evolve. They must stay the same as they were in, for example, 1939. Which is a problem, because our cities are not museums. They evolve. They change over time. Central has changed since 1906. Why can our suburbs not do the same? So just like we're able to modernise Central while still preserving its heritage, as I'm certain most people agree, someone from 1906 would easily recognise Central from 2023. Well, why don't we apply that same logic to our suburbs? So, let's take this row of shops in Annandale as an example. These are protected under the conservation area, as very evidently they were built pre-1939, and as a result, they still appear like they were in 1939. So if we were to adapt them to modern uses, well, we wouldn't inherently need to demolish them. You could easily preserve the facade and build up, like this example of the Star Casino, preserving the old Piedmont Power Station, or even this example in Newcastle East, where an old Art Deco building has been preserved. In both those scenarios, the building has been preserved, so has its character, but it's been readapted for new purposes, which also helps make space for new shops, workplaces, and residences. Someone from the 1930s could easily still look at the old power station at Piedmont or that old mid-rise in Newcastle and still recognise them. Their character has still been preserved, just they've been modernised and reused for modern purposes. In the case of those shops at Annandale, you just need to preserve the shops and build up. That means the streetscape fundamentally remains the same, while still being able to use the airspace above. Obviously, what this could be very much changes depending on the situation, whether that might be 1 or 2 stories or a full tower block. It depends on the demand. This doesn't really work for detached buildings like single-family homes, but often they probably don't warrant preservation anyway. Obviously, some buildings should be preserved in their entirety, but these should be reserved for very significant buildings, because the notion of preserving our entire suburb as it was in 1939 is just ridiculous. There's also the other option of just building a new building in the old architectural style, although I do understand that's not necessarily the same as preserving an older building. And also, demolishing and just preserving the facade is also not the same as just having that older building. But our cities need to change over time. They are not static, they need to change. And fundamentally, people take priority over buildings. We should prioritise more homes over preserving older buildings. But that doesn't mean we should just demolish all older buildings. Our goal should be to balance preservation with people needing homes. But at the end of the day, people take priority over buildings. So with that, this video comes to an end. Fundamentally, our cities are not museums. They need to change over time, but our current heritage system views them as such, which often results in working and middle-class people who often built these suburbs being locked out in order to preserve their character. If we want a more equal Australia, where everyone has a right to experience our common heritage, then we need to seriously review how our current heritage and heritage conservation system works. Although, you might disagree. This is fundamentally an opinion piece at the end of the day. Am I correct on everything? Or am I a complete idiot? Please, I'd love to hear your take. Either way, thank you for watching. Please like and please subscribe if you enjoyed.